Good evening, friends. My name is Elias Sacks. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies at CU Boulder. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with Professor Samira Mehta on eco-kashrut, food, Jews, justice. This webinar is the first program in our newly reimagined Peak to Peak series. This is a program that brings CU Boulder faculty into conversation with audiences and communities across Colorado and beyond. And this series is truly a collaborative effort. It's supported by CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement, and it's a partnership with communities and civic organizations across Colorado. And I just want to begin tonight by thanking all of those groups. First and foremost, the Office for Outreach and Engagement and their amazing team, especially Lisa Schwartz and Sue Shears, and all of our community partners, the Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Durango Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder Jewish Community Center, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. We are so grateful to all of you for your partnership. So in a moment, I want to introduce our speaker, but first a word on the program itself. We've described this program as a conversation, and we really hope that it will be precisely that. And this conversational aspect is going to take two forms. So first of all, after Professor Mehta presents for about 20 minutes or so, she and I will be in conversation with one another. More importantly, though, after that, we want to open things up for a genuine discussion, not just between me and Professor Mehta, but between you and Professor Mehta. And there are going to be two ways for you to engage her. The first is the Q&A function on your screen. Some of you may be webinar veterans and are familiar with, but for those of you who are not, at the bottom of your screen, you should see something that you can click on that says Q&A. If you click on that and type in a question, it will be visible to me. I'll share it with Professor Mehta and with the broader group, and she'll respond. And the second way you can engage us in conversation is the chat function. So somewhere near that Q&A button, there should be a button that says chat. If you click on that, you can write a comment or a question. And again, I'll share that with Professor Mehta and the group, and she will respond. And you don't need to wait till the end of the program to enter those questions and enter those comments. You can add them at any point, kind of as they occur to you, and we'll keep a running list and make sure that we get to have that conversation when we hit that point in the program. And to support those kinds of exchanges and to really try to make good on this commitment to really being a community of learners, we want to just take a moment now and give you all a chance to interact with one another. So I just want to invite you all to take a moment, and for anyone who is interested, I want to invite you to introduce yourself in that chat function. So click on it and just sort of just share something about yourself, where you're watching this from, why you decided to participate tonight. And this will be visible to everyone participating in tonight's program. And then once I'm done introducing Professor Mehta, we're going to change this so that the questions and comments will just be visible to the panelists, but we'll open it up again at the end. And so since none of you are really here to see me, all of you instead are here to see tonight's presenter. Let me introduce her. So Samira Mehta is an assistant professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies here at CU Boulder. Her research and teaching focus on the intersections between religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismica, The Christian-Jewish Blended Family in America, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and her current project, tentatively called God Bless the Pill, Sexuality, Contraception, and American Religion, examines the role of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant voices in debates about contraception, population control, and eugenics from the mid-20th century to the present. She holds leadership positions in just about any academic organization relating to Jewish studies or religious studies that you can name. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and simply say that I am thrilled to be learning from her and with her tonight. And I'll now turn things over to Professor Mehta.
Thank you so much, Professor Sacks, who said that as if we had not gone over a couple of versions of this talk in the past week. So I just want to start with a little bit of sort of overview of where we're going and how I'm going to do this. In order to understand eco-kashrut as a movement, as a contemporary meditation or variation on kashrut, the practice of keeping kosher, we're going to need to know something about keeping kosher. And I'm very aware that there are people who are joining us today from all parts of the world that we live in, right? There are people who are Jewish and who have been keeping kosher every single day since they were born. And there are people who perhaps know absolutely nothing about keeping kosher. Those people might be Jewish and might not be, right? Like there are lots and lots of kinds of knowledge in the room. And so one of the first things that's going to happen is that I'm going to go over some of the details and questions about keeping kosher. In doing that, there's something you might want to, a couple of things that I want you to note. People often are really curious about the whys with keeping kosher. Why do these rules exist? Where do they come from? We're going to talk a little bit about, there are a variety of answers to those questions. But sort of off the bat, the rules come from the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and from later rabbinic commentary, generally in the Talmud, although also sort of contemporary commentary, that are very elaborating on how we would go about the rules that we find in the Torah, in those first 5 books of the Bible. There are lots of other kind of questions about why and where they came from in the Bible. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But when you have why questions, hang on, we'll get there, or toss them into the chat. The sort of final point that I want to make before really moving into the meat of the lecture is both kashrut and eco-kashrut are practiced in a wide array of ways. It often, I'm going to be saying some things. I'm going to say like, these are the rules. And you might be thinking, I keep kosher and I don't do it that way. We will both get to the variations on the theme as we move through the lecture, but absolutely, there are lots of ways of enacting these rules. People prioritize the rules differently. And when we get to the eco-kashrut movement, you will see that that is true there as well. So let's go on to the very first slide. I guess we've had 2 slides already, but work with me here. So what is kashrut, or keeping kosher? It's a collection of rules, and the first set of rules that we're going to talk about tonight relate to the kinds of animals that you can eat. So it is acceptable to eat land animals that have split hooves and chew their cud. So functionally, what that means is that you can eat cows or beef, sheep, so lamb, goats, so mutton, deer, which is venison. You can't eat pigs or rabbits or squirrels or bears or dogs or cats or camels or horses. And again, in the terms of that question of why, like the reason is because the Torah says so, right? And moving on from there, the Torah does not list acceptable birds, but it does list categories of birds that are not okay. You can't eat birds of prey, and you can't eat scavengers. Functionally speaking, that means that poultry is kind of where it's at, right? You can eat poultry. I do realize that chickens and turkeys in their natural environment are birds of prey, and that they eat bugs and ticks and, toes if they can get them. But from this standpoint, we're talking about like hawks and raptors, things that eat roadkill. You can't eat anything that might eat roadkill or a mouse, right? Fish must have fins and scales. Shellfish is not acceptable. So shellfish is just out. In terms of fins and scales, if a fish has scales, it's presupposed to also have fins, but there are fish that have fins and not scales, or that have fins and scales for part of their life cycle, but not other points in their life cycle. So you can't eat monkfish. Swordfish sometimes has fins and scales and sometimes doesn't. But there is this concept that we're going to talk about in a minute called building a wall around the Torah. So you shouldn't just, like, if you're keeping kosher, don't eat swordfish. And then all other animals, anything that isn't on this list is a problem. So insects, bugs that you think are insects, but in fact are not, if you've taken a biology class, those are forbidden. All fruits, vegetables, and grains are fine, but as anyone who's ever had a garden knows, you do need to then wash them carefully to make sure that there are no insects in the plant, or in whatever you're eating. And that's one of those places where we all might think that that's gross, but if you're worried about keeping kosher, it's also a violation of Jewish law. So next slide, please. The next piece of what matters in keeping kosher is how the animal is killed. So I'm not actually going to talk very much about the cow guillotine that I have here, but you can take a look at it. Specifically, warm-blooded animals, so all of the mammals and birds that we've talked about, must undergo a specific process of slaughter in which a very sharp knife cuts the esophagus, the trachea, the carotid arteries, and the jugular vein. It has to be a smooth motion. That would be part of the virtue of the guillotine. And the goal here is to have all of the blood drain out. In fact, once the meat is slaughtered, it undergoes further treatment to remove blood from the animal. So sometimes it's broiled, it can be salted, brined to get blood out. It's also the case that even in a kosher animal, there are parts of the animal that can't be eaten. There are particular nerves and veins and things like that you can't eat that piece of the animal, or sometimes meat that surrounds it. So moving on from that is perhaps one of the more famous rules around keeping kosher. Like if people know a couple of things about keeping kosher, it's often no pork, no shellfish, and that you cannot mix milk and meat. So specifically what the Torah says is that you may not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So you could be really literal about that. If you have a baby goat, you may not cook it in its mother's milk. But how would you know? If you've got more than one goat and more than one kid, you might get it mixed up. You might milk all of your goats into one big pail. I don't have any idea how much milk you get out of a goat, but perhaps less than a pail. So you might use the same pail for multiple goats. You'd have a problem. So you can't do that, right? All milk and all meat. And you might not know what kind of milk you have. So you can't have beef and goat milk, right? You can't have any milk with any meat. I realize that chickens and turkeys and other forms of geese, ducks, they do not give milk, but you might, just like you might accidentally get goat milk or sheep milk or cow milk confused when dealing with mammals, you might think that what you have in front of you is beef or is chicken, and in fact it's beef, and make a mistake. So because of this concept of building a wall around the Torah, you just cannot combine milk and meat. And the rules go even further than that. Not only can you not eat a cheeseburger, but you can't fry a hamburger in a pan, wash the pan, make the pan all clean, and then make a grilled cheese sandwich in the same pan. So you need separate sets of pots and pans, anything you might cook with, a meat set and a dairy set. You will need separate dishes for your table. So this is why I've said this entire system, it leads to a lot of dishes, right? You need meat dishes and dairy dishes. If you want fancy, nice dishes for holidays, you need fancy meat dishes. If you're somebody who thinks that you can have a fancy meal and have it be a dairy meal, you need fancy dairy dishes. There's a holiday called Passover that generates an entirely separate set of dishes. Maybe you want fancy ones for that and everyday ones for that. You're talking about kind of a bare minimum in a kosher kitchen that does both milk and meat, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 sets of dishes and 4 sets of pots and pans. So we're talking about a lot of dishes, talking about separate sponges. You might have 2 ovens or 2 dishwashers if you have the space. There are workarounds if you don't have these things, the ovens and the dishwashers and everything, but there's a lot of accoutrement that goes into this. And that's important when we get to the place where we're talking about ways in which people sort of adapt these practices. You're talking about a lot of stuff. Now imagine that you're talking about my apartment in Denver, which is somewhere on the line between a studio and a 1-bedroom and does not have adequate kitchen space, and I am somebody with 1 set of dishes. Okay, so imagine like you're in a New York City apartment, a downtown Denver apartment. Tokyo is super expensive, right? Like the dishes could be a problem. People come up with modifications for no other reason than that. So another piece of the keeping kosher process, right? You're following all of these rules. You go to the store to buy something, and you want to know that the thing that you bought at the store followed all of these rules. Think about the fact that sometimes people put Parmesan cheese in meatballs. So you want to buy prepackaged meatballs. You need to know that they don't have Parmesan cheese. But also, like, you want to buy peanut butter, and you need to know that like the factory that made the peanut butter is not also making some sort of milk chocolate based spread, because maybe you want to serve the peanut butter in the same meal that you're serving a turkey sandwich, right? Like you want to serve a turkey sandwich and apples and peanut butter. And that peanut butter cannot therefore have ever touched a machine that touched milk. Peanut butter, by the way, in and of itself comes in a middle category, another category that the fruit and the vegetables are in, and nuts and grains, that is called parv. Think of it as neutral. You don't really need to know about it, but just sort of as a side note, right? So how do you know that? Food that is prepared in a kosher facility will have something called a hechsher. A hechsher means that a group of rabbis, a rabbinical certifier, came into the factory, and this could be Coca-Cola, like something huge, or it could be your neighborhood bakery, and said, okay, everything here is fine. All of the rules are being followed. This is kosher. It will usually also say that it is kosher and meat, or kosher and dairy, or kosher and parv. There are lots of different rabbinic certifications. I've got 8 different options in front of you. There are even more. I just liked this one because it's got like Kansas City, which is like kind of a small city, but in Kansas City, there's a specific place that will certify factories in Kansas City, right? And some of these places, they're not all using precisely the same rules. So some hechshers are better, which is a way of saying stricter than others. So if you're going to somebody's house, it might matter what certifications they think are good. This has resulted in me doing things like standing in a grocery store in Atlanta, Georgia, frantically asking my mother, like describing pictures of certifications to her and asking if I take this to a modern Orthodox person's house, will the person be willing to eat it, or will I have created some sort of faux pas? Right? Like you need to sort of know which ones are stricter and which ones are looser. Moving on from the question of the hechsher, some other facts about keeping kosher. But I want you to hold that question of like different levels of strictness in your head. So approximately 2% of Americans are Jews. Approximately 22% of Jews say that they keep kosher at home. What that means a range of different things. It means really different things for different people. We're going to be talking about that in a moment. But right now, what I want you to be paying attention to is under 2% of Americans are Jews. Fewer than a quarter of Jews keep kosher. That means fewer than, if I've done the math right, 0.5 Americans care about hechshers at all. And yet, in 2014, 40% of the new packaged foods were certified as kosher. So what that means is that, like, for some reason, Coca-Cola thinks it's worth making sure that their food is kosher. We're gonna, again, talk about why that is and how that came to be, because it's an interesting campaign, right? And there's a little bit of a dynamic there. But you'll remember that I said just now that keeping kosher can mean a range of things. People keep kosher in a really wide variety of ways. You'll note that it says here that one of those ways is being or often being vegetarian or vegan. Hold that in your head for when we talk about eco-kashrut. But in the meantime, There are people who do all of the things that I just described with all the different dishes and the different sponges and the separate microwaves and all of that. And they really care that there are hechshers on all of the food, all of the prepared food that comes into the house. There are people who keep kosher in that way, but they don't care about the hechshers, either across the board, or they've decided that they don't care about hechshers for cheese, or they've decided that they don't care about hechshers for wine, specific categories of foods they might not care about. There are other people who think that hechshers are a racket. They care a lot about the system, but they think that like basically the hechshers don't prove anything, so they don't care about that. There are people who keep kosher at home with all of these rules and restrictions, but they only eat kosher food when they leave their house. There are other people who keep kosher with all of these rules at home, but they eat vegetarian or vegan food when they leave their house. Sometimes those people will also bring vegetarian or vegan food into their house and eat it off of their regular old plates, maybe their dairy plates if it's like vegetarian food, or whichever plates if it's vegan food, right? Other people will bring that food in, but they'll eat it off of paper plates. Still other people keep kosher at home and eat whatever they want when they leave, right? Like in the house, everything is kosher, and outside of the house, what a professor of mine in div school used to refer to as a bacon cheeseburger with lobster sauce is fine outside of the house. There are people who do that. There are people who bring that non-kosher food into their house and eat that off of paper plates. So you would never put a pepperoni pizza on your china, but you can eat it off of paper plates. I have a mentor who grew up in a strictly kosher household, but he's from Maryland, where crab is the local delicacy. They ate crab in the basement, really far away from the kitchen where everything kosher was kept. And when they were done, they folded everything back into the like brown paper that they had put down and threw it away. I think they maybe had separate mallets that they cleaned outside, but other than that, right? Like people do lots of things. And one of the things that they do is be vegetarian or vegan. Sometimes they are doing this because they don't have space for all of the dishes. If you're vegetarian, you only need dairy dishes. If you're vegan, everything is automatically in that neutral category. Other times, people are vegetarian or vegan because like maybe they have returned to Jewish practice and they have relatives, parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles who would be really judgy about that, but who are like hip, cool Americans who would be cool with the fact that you're a vegetarian or a vegan. That's also something that happens. So there's a wide array of what it looks like to keep kosher. There are also a wide collection of assumptions about keeping kosher. And this is one of the reasons why so much packaged food is labeled kosher. American Jews wanted more access to prepared food, which meant more of that food needed to be kosher. So in the 1970s, there was sort of a campaign that was launched that suggested that kosher food is cleaner or more hygienic somehow than non-kosher food, and that it's more ethical. So either that it's more humane than conventional slaughter, or that somehow the labor practices for the people are more humane. There are some implications of this. Remember, I said we would talk about why, right? So there are people who are like, kashrut is a way of being kinder in the world. It is more humane. There are also people who argue that this cleanerness is part of the original reason, right? Like somehow pork causes trichinosis. Jews had this knowledge and therefore avoided pork because pork is dangerous. Here's the thing, and this is true in general, this is true historically, and it's true in contemporary settings. None of this is true. It's just not true. Observe my Ghostbusters sign. It is just not true. So historically speaking, Jews and Greeks were in the same area and had a lot to do with each other. If Jews had known that that pork was particularly dangerous, you would assume that Greeks would have heard them talking about that, come to the conclusion that they were correct, and given up pork. This is not what happened. But in the contemporary setting, kosher slaughter, for instance, with animals It's about how the animal is killed. And yeah, there are rules like it can't be obviously sick, but it doesn't say that it has to be kept in any sort of clean environment. It doesn't say it has to be humane. Doesn't say that the chicken can't be in a teeny tiny little box stuffed filled with antibiotics. It says nothing about feedlots. So there's no reason to think, and in fact, in like, I don't know, a Hershey's candy bar factory, it's saying meat hasn't been there. It hasn't said that the FDA or Health and Human Services or, you know, whoever it is that's doing that approving would think that the floor had been mopped recently enough or that no one was coughing on things, right? It's just about these separations. So it turns out that it's not actually cleaner or more humane or anything like that. Those assumptions, which were part of an active marketing campaign, are not necessarily true. And that actually leads us directly to the eco-kashrut movement. Eco-kashrut is in some ways an attempt to make those things true. It's this idea that one would take human and environmental cost of food into account when deciding what to eat. And it's an evolving set of practices. So different people, just like people keep kosher in different ways, different people take different factors into account and come to different conclusions when making decisions. So you might decide the best way to be from a humane standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, is to be a vegan. And someone else might say, you know what? As long as it's free range and ethically slaughtered, I think it's fine to eat meat, or it's fine to eat meat sometimes, right? And you might have a decision that's anywhere in between. Sometimes this means you're combining Jewish dietary laws with these principles of environmentalism or humane treatment of animals or fair labor practices, and other times not. So the example that I want to use here is it turns out that humanely raised kosher meat is hard to get your hands on. It's a very small market. It's a lot of requirements in both directions. It's really expensive. So there are people who have said, I want to eat meat, but I think it's more important that the meat is humanely raised and slaughtered than that it is kosher. And they will call that eco-kashrut. They will say, all things being equal, I am somebody who would only eat kosher meat. I can't get humanely raised kosher meat. I'm privileging humanely raised over ritually slaughtered. So moving on to a bit of the history of the eco-kashrut movement. The first wave of eco-kashrut really gets started in the 1970s. It gets its kind of first legs in the Reconstructionist movement, but it really gets named and elaborated on by Reb Zalman, a founder of the Jewish Renewal movement. So that's particularly exciting for those of us who are located in Boulder, because he's a very important kind of local figure for us. And he's really the first person to say, like, okay, what if we thought about kashrut in terms of what we in the contemporary world recognize as ethical? And what if we understood that what is ethical is going to be a moving target, right? Like slaughter practices might change, or in a world with factory farming, different things might be ethical than in other, like if you're dealing with boutique farms, right? Like what is ethical is not going to be historically fixed and constant. You then get a second wave of eco-kashrut in the 1990s. And if Reb Zalman is special for Boulder, Arthur Waskow is special for me because he was my neighbor in Philadelphia. He's the founder and director of the Shalom Center and a co-founder of Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. And he really kind of revives eco-kashrut in the 1990s. And he's got a quote here that really expands it beyond food. And he says, we should ask, is it eco-kosher to eat vegetables and fruit that have been grown by drenching the soil with insecticides? Is it eco-kosher to drink Shabbat Kiddush wine from non-biodegradable plastic cups? Is it eco-kosher to use 100% unrecycled office paper and newsprint in our homes, our synagogues, our community newspapers? Might it be, and remember that comment about a moving target, eco-kosher to insist on 10% recycled paper this year, 30% in 2 years, and 80 in 5 years? And so I'm not going to keep reading the quote, but this, you can see an expansion here beyond what we eat into how we live. And we are now in the third wave of the eco-kashrut movement. It really kind of got started around 15 years ago. And part of what happened were some scandals involving kosher slaughter, specifically coming out of Pottsville, Iowa, which had horrible hygiene, really miserable treatment of animals. It was really inhumane. And some big scandals about their treatment of undocumented workers and, just sort of exploiting human labor. So it was bad on all sorts of counts. And it blew up this idea that kosher food is somehow cleaner and more ethical, and caused a real internal Jewish accounting. But also in the broader world, we were seeing more environmentalism, vegetarianism, and veganism rising. And so that is also feeding back into a Jewish food movement. And so I want to close with this is an excellent book of meditations from scholars and practitioners on life as Jewish vegans and vegetarians. For some people, eco-kashrut is a way of making their kosher practice really meaningful. Sometimes it's a byproduct of how it is that they're going about being kosher, but that isn't really eco-kosher, even if it looks the same, right? If it's not animated by these values, it's a different deal. But for other people, the environmentalism, the vegetarianism, and the veganism are ways of reconnecting with kosher identity. So in this book, one of the editors, who is also a contributor, Jacob Lebens, writes about how he grew up keeping kosher and for a wide array of reasons left the kind of Jewish community in which he was raised. He became a vegan for reasons that have to do with environmentalism and animal rights, and discovered that being vegan, even though he actually explicitly once told me that he is a vegan except for bivalves, so he's violating kosher rule in that, connects him to his Jewish identity. It gives him food rules that order his life in ways that are intensely meaningful for him. And even though it's a very different practice, it makes him feel connected to his Judaism in ways that are powerful and meaningful. And so that's what I want to end my piece of the talk with, by saying eco-kashrut can animate people's environmentalism or their animal rights or their labor practices because they're concerned about how to live out ethical values that they get to from their Judaism. But some people get to those ethical values outside of their Judaism, and through those values are reconnected to Judaism. And on that note, I really look forward to my conversation with Professor Sacks and with all of you.
So thank you so much, Professor Mehta, for that presentation. In a moment, we're going to open up the conversation to questions from the entire group. So if you have questions, a number of you have already started to post those. I would encourage you to continue to post them either in that Q&A button down there or in the chat function. But right now, I'm going to just shamelessly take advantage of the vast authority invested in me in virtue of my sacred position as the Zoom webinar co-host and Zoom webinar license holder, and kick off the conversation with a few questions myself. And the first has to do with maybe kind of the status of eco-kashrut and these emerging practices in the contemporary Jewish world. How widespread are these, and how controversial are these? I mean, are these sorts of practices relatively rare? Are they becoming more prevalent? And what kind of reaction are they generating? You know, ritual innovation can generate skepticism, worry, opposition. Is that the case here? Do we see kind of critiques or concerns relating to eco-kashrut, maybe even among groups sympathetic to it? So I was wondering if you could first say a little bit about the status of eco-kashrut. How widespread is it, and how controversial is it?
So how widespread is it? Roughly 10%, 10% of Americans are either vegetarian or vegan. So that's not a lot of, that's like not most of the population by a long shot. 2% are Jews. So it's worth noting that there are many more vegetarian and vegan people in Jewish community than one would expect. It's far more than 10% of the Jewish world. And if you add in people who are kind of vegetarian and vegan because it simplifies keeping kosher, or who eat meat really rarely. It's a notable percentage, but we don't have like actual statistics. No one has run out and done a quantitative study of this. I would say it's a growing trend, but it's a really vibrant conversation, but it's not, like this is sweeping the nation. It's maybe coming closer to sweeping the Jewish nation, but it isn't. In terms of concerns or critiques, I think there are kind of two schools of critique. There is a group of people who think that it's like just horrible to be vegetarian or vegan and gross. And it's, think of this as, I mean, he's not Jewish, but think of this in terms of Anthony Bourdain of blessed memory, who referred to vegetarians and their, I believe, and their Hezbollah-like splinter faction, the vegans, as being just killjoys, enemies of anything that is delicious, right? That is the Anthony Bourdain position. It's a foodie position. You're killjoys, you're moralistic bores is basically what that argument would look like. An argument that I find much more persuasive, and this is in part because my degree is in religious studies, and so I think a lot about ritual, is that food is really tied in with identity, right? I make what I personally believe and have been told by my friend Rebecca, who is of course an authority on these things, a very delicious vegetarian matzo ball soup. I tried to make a vegan matzo ball soup and I could not get the matzo balls to hold without egg. It fell apart. I gather it can be done. My friend Nora Rubel, food scholar and vegan, is excellent at it. I am not. There's loss, right? And no matter what, that's not a chicken matzo ball soup. It's not chicken soup with matzo balls. Brisket is gone. My friend Ben Zeller, food scholar and no longer but former vegetarian, made an excellent tofrisket, but it's not brisket. Also, there are moments when you can have conflict with Jewish law. So I didn't get into the Passover rules, but if you're vegan, I'm not actually sure you could keep Ashkenazi Passover rules and not be hungry throughout the entire Passover holiday. You can keep the Sephardic rules because Sephardic Jews eat legumes during Passover. Ashkenazi Jews traditionally do not. If you're vegan, you're going to have to decide, am I going to be a little miserable for a week or 8 days? Or am I going to not follow the traditions of my ancestors? And I know, for instance, that Passover turns out not to feel like Passover to me if I'm eating rice and beans. Like it feels too easy. I just don't notice that I'm doing it, right? So there's loss in those ways. Traditions. Can you make even if you can make I have a great vegetarian chopped liver recipe made out of lentils. It is not like my great grandmother's chopped liver recipe, right? Just isn't.
So I actually want to pick up on one aspect of what you said. You related some of these reactions to eco-kashrut, to people's personal identity. And a few times you invoked your own personal identity. I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about how you came to be interested in this topic. And in particular, right, you are a professor not just of Jewish studies, but of women and gender studies. Mm-hmm. What does any of this have to do, not just with your interests in general in Judaism and religion, but in particular with your interests in questions relating to gender and sexuality?
So I'm going to just sort of say personally, I was instructed not to look at the chat, but I am looking at the chat. Becky O'Brien has said that there's an irony in Bourdain's perspective. And what the irony being that eco-kashrut people and or vegetarians and vegans can be much more attentive to their food. I think Bourdain would argue that that's not true. I'm totally with with Becky on this point. I personally am a vegetarian. I have been a pescatarian at times when a combination of some food allergies And living in the American South made it really hard. I'm personally allergic to eggplant, and it turns out that eggplant parmesan was the thing that the American South knew to feed me. And when I told them I would eat salmon, that made it just easier to be a guest in people's homes. Once I didn't feel sort of, as it became easier to be vegetarian out and about, and when I left the South, I stopped doing that. So I've got some personal interest there. I am somebody who studies, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on interfaith families, and I got very interested in food studies as a field because it is a place of porous ritual. So people will say you may not have a Christmas tree in your house if you're an interfaith family that is affiliating with Judaism. People say that a little bit less than they did maybe 40 years ago, but people certainly say that. They're much less likely to say you can't take your grandmother's gingerbread recipe and cut it into dreidels, right? Like you can still make your Christmas cookies as long as you use Hanukkah themed Christmas cookie cutters. I don't really have a sense that Hanukkah cookies are a thing because cookies are not deep fried, which is the Hanukkah thing. But like, as you can, there's a certain malleability. So I've got this really longstanding personal interest in food. I've been a vegetarian for over 30 years, and I am in my early 40s. I got started young. I really credit my parents who were like, okay, you have to follow these health rules. In terms of women and gender studies, I would say one thing personally and one thing professionally. My colleagues who are I'm more in the like ritual family memory corner of food studies, although I periodically look with interest in the ethics piece. But my friend and colleague Adrienne Crone will comment. She's been helping me put together a syllabus for a course that I'm teaching in the fall. And it's a real struggle. The big voices in the movement, the eco-kashrut movement, and in vegetarian and vegan movements in general are often male voices. The people doing the work, like in the kitchens and in the movements, and if you look at the numbers of people who don't eat meat, much more likely to be women, non-binary folks. The big voices are, I'm not going to blame Adrienne for this. I'm going to say this is me not being able to resist a pun since we're talking about vegetarianism. It's kind of a sausage fest. Personally, I would note that my very first restaurant memory is actually of a lesbian separatist feminist vegetarian restaurant called Bloodroot, which is in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And one of the founders of the collective is someone who was raised Jewish and identifies and talks about how vegetarianism in part felt like a way of living into that Jewish identity in ways that didn't work for her anymore when she wanted more distance. But she said sort of in ways that for her, vegetarianism is part of feminist politics, increased exploitation of female animals. And in fact, the restaurant is now a vegan restaurant. But there are longstanding ties. There's a book that I'll be teaching chunks of in the fall called The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams, who is not Jewish, who is, I believe, Presbyterian, maybe Protestant. But there are longstanding links between feminism and vegetarian diets as well.
Fantastic. So what I want to do now is I'm going to resist the temptation to continue asking my questions and start trying to channel some of the questions I'm hearing from the broader group. And one of the things I'm going to try to do is combine questions. So we're having a number of questions about the relationship between kashrut in general and eco-kashrut in particular, and food practices in other kinds of religious traditions. And I was wondering if you could say anything about kind of the parallel movements or similar developments in other sorts of religious communities. Do we see similar kinds of debates, developments, revisions, reimaginings of food practices in Christian communities, Muslim communities, Hindu communities, Buddhist communities, in other kinds of religious communities today?
So there is an eco-halal movement. I wish I had been able to read up on it before tonight, but not only am I in Connecticut, but my copies of the book in question are in Boulder, and I have not been to my office since March. Thank you, COVID-19. But the eco-halal movement is interesting. It exists in the US and Canada. I don't know if it exists abroad, and there are links between the eco-halal movement and eco-kashrut movements. that you can see some of this in the colleague I mentioned, Adrienne Crone, in her work. You can also, I am blanking on her last name. There is a woman named Aldea, I think it's Mulhern, but I would have to get back to you on that, who also writes on these movements. There are other times when justice and food become linked. So if you think about the food practices of the Nation of Islam, in part they don't eat pork because that's, part of Islam and something that Elijah Muhammad learned about from his study of Islam, but they also don't eat some of the traditional soul food markers that they felt were foods of enslavement that are not necessarily healthy. Now, just for the record, soul food can be done in ways that is in fact very healthy, and also soul food is eaten across the South in all in white communities and Black communities. But the argument that the Nation of Islam makes is this is food of enslavement, it is food of oppression, and it is not designed for health purposes. And so you can see in movements like that where it's a racial justice message, right? So there are other ways in which food gets linked to questions of justice for sure.
Thank you. Please.
I just wanted to toss one counterexample in. That is something, that I think is important. And that is, I have a really wonderful colleague at CU who is, on the one hand, deeply respectful of my vegetarianism, and on the other hand, grew up in India from a high caste family. And one of the things that my colleague would note is that in India, caste politics are tied into vegetarianism. And so as somebody who really opposes caste politics, and in particular as a high caste person who opposes caste politics, my colleague does not feel that they can be vegetarian or vegan, even though they are both deeply respectful of my vegetarianism and will say, and environmentally and from an animal rights perspective, we all understand that the vegans are right? Like this is environmentally not as good. Like they'll say that, but they feel that there's this other political thing. There's a human rights issue. To be a high caste vegetarian for them says, I ally myself with this political position that I think is untenable. So there's also a reason to not be vegetarian, a deeply ethical political reason to not be vegetarian in that context.
So I actually want to pick up on exactly that question of the diversity of these food practices and the diversity of what it means to take these kind of questions of ethics into account. Because we're getting a number of questions about diversity within eco-kashrut. And one of them precisely has to do with vegetarianism. So to what extent is eco-kashrut linked to vegetarianism, and to what extent are there kind of pockets or versions of eco-kashrut where the consumption of meat is embraced, where maybe even the consumption of shellfish and pork and other traditionally non-kosher food is embraced, provided that it is raised and treated and killed in an ethical manner. So that's one question, kind of the status of meat in eco-kashrut. And the second question is the status of maybe foods that we don't traditionally or content that we don't traditionally link to kashrut. So what about chemicals? What about something like aspartame? I've actually never said the word aspartame out loud, so I may be mispronouncing it. But are there concerns in eco-kashrut relating to the chemicals that go into food? Are there chemicals that are seen as maybe strictly speaking kosher, but not eco-kosher? So I wonder if you could say something about these questions of the diversity and capaciousness within eco-kashrut itself.
So yes, I'm going to just mention quickly from an animal like humanitarianism standpoint, I've got a thunderstorm going on in the background, which means I also have a cat freaking out. So if a cat leaps onto me, that's for everyone, that's what's going on. At the moment, we seem to be fine, but just an alert. So first of all, in terms of the chemicals, that's actually not something I know a ton about. My assumption is that there are absolutely people, I wouldn't have put it this way in terms of my own life, but including me, who really do try as part of a kind of I might not have linked it to the kashrut piece, but the part of me that is interested in the eco piece is also generally speaking, interested in trying to not have a ton of processed food. It's an interesting piece because, again, there are all of these tensions, right? So if you're a person who is doing vegetarian or vegan food because you're super committed to fake meat, I'm going to tell you that like Morningstar Farms breakfast sausage is one of my very favorite things. And when we were in high school, my sister's boyfriend used to like to read the list of chemicals in this like theoretically better for you vegetarian sausage. I can't say whether Morningstar Farms breakfast links are better or worse for you than he wasn't reading the list of chemicals off of the sausage, because we didn't have sausage in the house. But like actually, I became vegetarian and I got my hands on vegetarian sausage, which was too processed to be allowed in my parents' hippy dippy household when I was growing up, right? Like, so there is this tension. Are you going for really clean eating? Are you going for processed food, right? You might actually be able to make a case for local, humanely slaughtered meat that is low processed being better than a vegan diet that involves lots of Morningstar Farms chicken nuggets that are not only highly processed, but the product of monocrop agri farming in like Iowa or wherever it is that soy comes from. Actually, a lot of our soy is imported. So like which one of those is better for the environment? Which one of those is better for you? There are really legitimate differences of opinion. Not only that, but if you're a vegan who's eating like grapes that have been sprayed with pesticides, you've got some real labor problems there, right? You've got fruit pickers giving birth to children with disabilities that are the product of these chemicals, and you're ingesting those chemicals too. Which way do you want to go? If you want to eat entirely local and organic produce, you're going to have a problem in the middle of the winter unless you're a pretty serious home canner, right? There are legitimate tensions and disagreements here.
So I want to pick up on one more thing you said, and this will be our last question because we're getting towards the end of our webinar. A few of you, I apologize, we're not going to get to your questions, but we have them recorded and you can certainly follow up with us on them. But what I want to pick up on is not the Morningstar Farms discussion, because if we have to abandon Morningstar Farms in my family, I'm going to get a lot of pushback from 2 people under the age of 9.
You'll get pushback from me. All of our viewers should understand that I probably have at least once or twice a month Shabbat dinner of Morningstar Farms products with Professor Sacks's children.
I think that
Professor Sacks.
That is correct. But instead, I actually want to pick up on the question of locally produced food. And you had a brief moment where you said, some of the soy is imported from abroad. And one of the questions we had in the Q&A is actually precisely on the extent to which eco-kashrut is an American phenomenon reflecting the way food is raised in America. We know a lot about questions and potential problems with food production and the way animals are treated in the United States. Do those kinds of concerns exist with food, let's say meat that's raised outside of the United States? Is eco-kashrut interested in, does it think about kind of this on a kind of granular level, where it thinks about what does it mean to get food from outside the United States, where maybe kind of food practices are different? So I'm wondering if maybe as our kind of closing question, you can reflect a little bit about the extent to which eco-kashrut is an American phenomenon and the extent to which it is expanding beyond the US, and maybe also taking into account food preparation practices outside the US.
I am actually going to sort of say to you, I got to be honest here, I'm an Americanist. I don't professionally know very much about the world outside of the United States. I will say that from the perspective of being inside of the United States, if one of the things you're worried about is the carbon footprint of your food, fresh like fruits and vegetables and meat, things that can't be frozen and get here on a ship, leaving aside the fact that cargo ships are a nightmare, but food that needs to travel by airplane has a really high carbon footprint. So that's going to be a problem from an eco-kashrut standpoint. I think, you know, there are movements in places like the European Union against industrial farming, but I was previewing a podcast for my class in the fall that was talking about foie gras, which is sort of really, really fancy, arguably inhumane, or maybe very, very humane goose liver. That is traditionally raised in sort of boutique farming environments. And there's a food tourism. You can like meet the geese and ducks in France. But there's actually also starting to be an industrial farming process there. So I think that on the one hand, our food practices are more likely to be industrialized than in some places abroad, although not all places abroad. But we might also, there might be a small element of romanticization of what happening abroad. There's also this carbon footprint concern. The other thing to remember is if part of what you care about is a hechsher, except for Israel, like it isn't true that the bulk of mass-produced food in other countries is necessarily going to be kosher. Sometimes it is, right? Like one of the hechshers that I had up there was from India. But if you're talking about like sort of the mass production, much more of our mass-produced food is kosher than in other places. And that is because up until very recently, there were more Jews in the United States than anywhere else in the world.
Thank you. Well, so unfortunately, we are out of time. And so I want to just close this conversation with three very brief items. The first is a word of gratitude. And I want to thank all the people who made this possible. So again, the Office of Outreach and Engagement at CU Boulder for their support, all of our diverse community partners across Colorado, my colleague Linda Park in Jewish Studies, our amazing tech guru Sean Wall, and of course Professor Mehta. I also want to thank my colleague Eyal Rivlin and Danya Rivlin for that beautiful music that you heard at the beginning of the program. That's their song Shalom from their album Coming Home. So thank you to all of them. I also want to let you know we have more events coming up. Our next program will be with our colleague David Schneer. He is about to publish a new book called Grief, the Biography of a Holocaust Photo. And on Thursday, August 20th at 12 p.m. Mountain Time, we will have a celebration and conversation with him about that book and about the kind of concept of grief and this particular iconic Holocaust photograph that it really stands at the center of the story he tells. And we're going to be unrolling a series of additional webinars throughout the fall. We'll have programs on American law and Judaism. We'll have programs on Jewish music, programs on the Middle East, programs on Jewish-Muslim relations. We'll also have a series of Israel-Palestine webinars on public health and the pandemic in the Middle East right now with scholars from the fields of Israel studies and Palestine studies. So I hope to see many of you again. And then finally, I want to express a word of gratitude to all of you who participated tonight. Really one of the best parts of teaching at a public university is the kind of privilege of spending time with the public, of learning together, of thinking together, and of growing together. And I know that you have many Zoom options these days, and we're just so grateful that you took the time to be with us and think with us. So with that, we're actually just going to again open the chat for you to be able to post to everyone. If you'd like to post any final words that go not just to the panelists, make sure you click on all panelists and attendees. And we look forward to learning with you at another event sometime soon.